I'm going to be talking about peptic ulcer disease. P-U-D. And what peptic ulcer disease is ulcers of the stomach and duodenum. Before I can really talk about peptic ulcer disease, I think I should go ahead and kind of cover how the acid and stuff is stimulated in the stomach. Just enough so that you can understand the disease process and how a couple of things lead to peptic ulcer disease. And those couple of things that I'll be talking about are NSAID abuse and Helicobacter pylori. Right? I'll talk about those two things and how they lead to peptic ulcer disease. And you can see the stomach here. Come down with the esophagus, come into the stomach here, and then it goes out the duodenum. Let's just imagine that I take a little piece of this lining here and threw it over here so that we can look at some of the different cells that do the work of creating the acid in our stomach. And actually not just the acid, the mucus, protective lining of the stomach. You need to talk about those couple of things in order to understand this peptic ulcer disease. Okay, so I've got a couple of things here that I've drawn out. I've drawn this lining. Right? This is supposed to represent the gastric lining in the stomach. And I've got these mucus producing cells, right, in brown. Right? And then the D here is a delta cell. The G cell, which produces gastrin, another mucus cell. And then over here I've got the parietal cell. Parietal cell is the big one when it comes to producing our acid. In the parietal cell we have this proton pump. There's actually a couple of different pumps, but we're just going to talk about one of them. The proton pump, and it pumps acid into the stomach, right? So then we got to figure out what stimulates that guy to do this job, right? Well, if when you get food in here or the stomach is not acidic enough, a message goes up to the brain. The brain, via the vagus nerve, sends a message down to start producing acid. And you got to remember, the vagus nerve, right, cranial nerve number 10, right, it comes down here, and it stimulates this ECL cell. I didn't mention that yet, but we have this cell here. It's called the ECL cell. And when the vagus nerve comes down here, now the vagus nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, right? And when we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, we are talking about the part of the nervous system, right, that does the rest and digest, right? You got the sympathetics, which is fight or flight, parasympathetics, which is rest and digest. So let's do some digesting, right? So the parasympathetic nervous system uses acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine gets released from this vagus nerve, and it stimulates the ECL cell. The ECL cell releases histamine 2, right? H2. Now don't mix that up with my hydrogen ion up here, the H with the plus, right? The plus means it's an ion, so hydrogen ion means it has a charge, right? It means it's not balanced, so it has a positive charge because it lost its electron. So you've got your hydrogen ion up here, and it looks a lot like your histamine 2 down here, but they're nothing alike, right? We're talking about two totally different things here. Just happen to both start with H's, right? Hydrogen and histamine. So the histamine 2 is released from the ECL in response to vagus nerve stimulation using acetylcholine neurotransmitter. Histamine 2 comes up and it stimulates the parietal cell, and more specifically it stimulates the parietal cell's proton pump. And so now the proton pump starts kicking out hydrogens. And you can see here I got a potassium in here. To keep that cell balanced, it brings in a potassium, which is a positive charge, and while it kicks out the hydrogen, which has a positive charge. That keeps your parietal cell balanced. So it's kicking out the hydrogen in here, so the hydrogen ions are acid, right? They're acidic. So that's what pH is. It's a negative log of the pressure of hydrogen ions, right? So So we know that. So we know that you're putting all them hydrogen ions in there, you're making it acidic. And that's the whole goal, right? Response to the food or response to the higher pH, it ends up doing this. Ends up stimulating your vagus nerve, your parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest and digest, ends up stimulating your parietal cell. So now, that is one way that that is one way that the stomach is stimulated to produce acid. I'm just going to talk about one more way, and I'm not talking about your pepsinogen and stuff, that more specifically for the protein breakdown. But what I'm going to talk about here is the G cell. Right? What your G cell does is, in response to the presence of amino acids in the stomach, and amino acids come from protein breakdown, right? They come from protein breakdown, so in response to amino acids in your stomach, the G cells release gastrin. Right? In response to amino acid. Gastrin released in response to amino acids. And gastrin comes right over here, and it stimulates the parietal cell also. So now the parietal cell, in response to amino acids, releases gastrin, and the parietal cell is stimulated, and the proton pump starts working. And now the proton pump is putting out more acid. You need more acid, I guess, to break down the protein, because that's what amino acids are. They are the product of broken down proteins. Now let's come over here and we'll talk about the delta cell. Right? So we've been talking about ways that the system makes the acid. Now we're going to talk about ways that the system protects itself from that acid, or lowers the acid when we get too much. So our system has turned on here. It's putting the acid out, right? Got something in here. These guys here kicked in, and they're pumping this acid out. It starts getting too acidic. The food's got the chyme and stuff is very acidic, and it's starting to like kick it out down into the duodenum, and the acidity is just way too high, right? It's getting really, really acid. We got to have a system. But your body always has a system of balance, right? Something that does one thing, and it's got to have something else to slow that down, right? And the way it slows this down, the acid production, or the acidity of the stomach, is with these delta cells. So in response to this outrageous acidity, and that's supposed to be pink. See, I got a pink marker. This is a red marker, right? That's a pink one. And the pink one, that's how red it is. And it's an Amazon marker. I noticed that they were a lot darker. I wonder what the red looks like. It doesn't look a whole lot different than the pink, does it? Well, let's see. Let me get rid of this here. I just scribbled on there for nothing. Now, in response to this high acidity, our negative feedback here, the delta cell releases somatostatin. And what the somatostatin does is it suppresses the parasympathetic nervous system activity, right? So it blocks the acetylcholine activity here in the stomach. So we come over here, boom, it comes, let's just go right through that there, and blocks this. Right, so it's going to block this activity right here and stop this stuff from being made. So that's the way the stomach says, hey, we're getting too acidic, we're starting to really irritate the stomach, let's cut this down and get rid of some of this acid, or stop making this acid is actually what it does, so it will stop making the acid. Now let's talk real quickly about the mucus cells. Very, very important when it comes to protecting the stomach. Parietal cells are stimulated to release acid. The mucus cells are stimulated to release mucus. Same thing when the lining starts getting irritated, the mucus cells can start releasing mucus, because that mucus layer is what protects the stomach, right? The lining of the stomach would get eaten alive by that acid. Well, it would be getting eaten by that acid. So it needs some way of protecting it. Stomach has that. I want you to know something. they use prostaglandins, right? Prostaglandins are messengers, local messengers, right? They get broke down out in the blood system, so they can't carry their messages far away, but right there, they're local messengers that carry little messages back and forth. It takes prostaglandins, I think it's a prostaglandin E1, to carry this message up, to carry this out. So, and what it's carrying out is, it is producing mucus in response to the high acid, produces mucus, and bicarb. You know what, I'm not going to write bicarb. I'm going to write it the way that you shouldn't get used to seeing it. And HCO3. HCO3. That's the 3 here. And so bicarb is a base, right? It's a buffer, so all the acid in there, it will neutralize that acid and stop it from getting into the lining of the stomach, right? So you have this layer. Now I can't draw it in there because it would just muck up everything that I got up here. But you got this layer of mucus over the top of this, and that's protecting this lining. It takes prostaglandins, prostaglandin E1, to carry this out. Now another place prostaglandin E1 is carrying these local messages to make things work is down here with the somatostatin, with the release, the delta cell. In order for it to do its job, it also needs this prostaglandin E1. Prostaglandin E1, right? So it also needs that. And that's an important part of understanding what happens with NSAID abuse in the stomach lining. And there's something that I want to bring up real quickly about the production of acid in the stomach. After surgery, you get acid released in the stomach, and the person's not able to eat, because normally when you get the acid released, and what's happened here is your epinephrine is out there, so your sympathetics are going crazy because you just had all of this noxious stimuli from the surgery. Sympathetics are kicked in. Whenever you have all that epinephrine, you need to increase your parasympathetic response too, because there's got to be some kind of balance. Now, even though the sympathetics are in charge here, right, they're the ones that are out in the lead, the sympathetic activity, the parasympathetic activity also increases. So you're going to get the release. You're going to get this the release of this acetylcholine here to stimulate this stuff, and you're going to end up with the histamine out here stimulating the proton pump. You're going to have acid in there, but you're also going to have the circulation to the stomach is going to be detoured away from the stomach, right? Because when the sympathetics are kicked in, which they are after surgery because they just went through all of this noxious stimuli, right? It's like a bear came through the door and just scared me and I got to take off running, right? I don't need all this circulation to my gut to be picking up nutrients and that stuff, right? Now, forget that. Go to the muscles. Detour it out to the muscles, because that's where we're probably going to need it. Well, the noxious stimuli of the surgery is doing that. So we got less stimulation to the lining of the stomach, but we still have acid being produced, right? So, and there's no food to come down there, because normally food comes down in here and it kind of mixes with this and it neutralizes this acid to a certain extent. And raises the pH a little bit to make it a little less acidic. In this case, after surgery, they're usually NPO, so they're going to get this acid in there, and already you don't have the normal circulation to the gut, and you're not eating, and you are putting acid in there. So a lot of times after surgery, they will prescribe an H2 blocker. H2 blocker, histamine 2, right? I talked about histamine 2 carries this message, right? It gets stimulated from the parasympathetics. The ECL cell releases histamine, it goes up here and stimulates the parietal cell proton pump to release acid. So if you give them an H2 blocker like, ranitidine has been taken off the market, but you still have cimetidine out there and famotidine. Don't know if they're going to end up being taken off the market. I don't really know any of those details, but they might have an H2 blocker, they might have a proton pump. post-surgery, just to protect the stomach from high acid after the surgery has been done. So now we're going to have to talk about the NSAID abuse and its effect on the stomach lining.